We do not have any military operations with Iran. Iran is one of the members of the BRICS. In fact, we held a BRICS summit yesterday online, and Iran was present, as were other countries like China, India, Ethiopia, Egypt, Brazil, and all others.
The US and Israel just launched a coordinated joint strike on Iran. Iran fired back, attacks on Israel and US bases across the region. So what does this mean for Africa? Well, this is a war. And when the world goes to war, scared money moves fast into oil, gold, and real assets. Africa is a commodity continent. And right now, every commodity Africa sits on just repriced.
The regime change in Iran is going to be impactful in the region.
If you look beyond Africa, what you find is that facade of the so-called global north, a group of countries that have long held themselves up as beacons of democracy and human rights, of liberty, justice, and the rule of law, is fast crumbling. Judiciaries are no longer independent. Citizens and lawful residents are being disappeared by mass law enforcement and then placed without due process indefinitely in detention centers. We see executive overreach and a steady weakening of legislative independence. We see violations of international law. Restrictions are being placed on freedom of speech, assembly, and protest. There's a general loss of liberties and a sharp decline in public trust in governments. Mwalimu Julius K. Nyerere famously said, "One does not judge one's state of health by comparing yourself to a sick person." For far too long, we compared ourselves to the West and used what we believe were their standards as our benchmarks for all our endeavors. The reality we see today should serve as a clear call to action. What should be our paradigm in understanding and interacting with the rest of the world, even as we preserve our dignity and cultural identity as Africans? Africa has been blessed with many of the world's natural resources, including gold, silver, diamond, copper, cobalt, uranium, oil, lithium, and more. At times, it becomes easy to overlook that our most significant inheritance is our people and their cultural heritage. Those who have benefited from our continent for centuries have always understood this powerful truth. And that is why Patrice Lumumba, Eduardo Mondlane, Thomas Sankara, and Amilcar Cabral were assassinated. And that is why the Asante Hene Nana Prempeh I and over 150 members of his clan and later Nana Yaa Asantewaa were all banished from the Gold Coast to the Seychelles. Similarly, Omukama Kabalega of Bunyoro in Uganda was also banished to Seychelles. This is why Sam Nujoma was forced into exile from Namibia, and Nelson Mandela was imprisoned on Robben Island, which was a former leper colony off the coast of Cape Town in South Africa. And this is why Steve Biko was murdered in prison. We felt the absence of these individuals and recognized the potential that we lost as a result. What I refer to in my book as the lost decades of Africa was that period from the mid to late 70s until the early 1990s, when the brain drain occurred and the continent stagnated. The median per capita growth of developing African countries at the time was 0.0%. We felt the loss of those who left to seek better opportunities for themselves and their families. These were ordinary people from all walks of life, like architects, doctors, engineers, artists, business people, bankers, and workers in the transportation and hospitality industries. Excellencies, honorable judges, imagine if Africa measured its wealth not by our natural resources, but by our people, valued individuals, free from oppression, conflict, persecution, and violence, and assured of the right to a life of dignity, liberty, and self-determination. What would that look like? how much differently would we see ourselves? What would that wealth mean for the strength and continued sovereignty of our nations? These are not just questions for a game of what if. They are based on the reality of Africa's near future. These are questions we must ask ourselves as leaders and citizens to determine the nations we are building and the world we wish to create for our children. By 2050, Africa's population will reach 2.5 billion, and more than a quarter of the world's population will be African. By the end of this century, nearly 40% of the world's population will be African. Already the median age of the African continent is 19, compared with nearly 45 in the European Union and 39 in the United States. Can we imagine the power we hold in our hands? Technological advances have made the world feel like a small place. At no other time in our lifetime was that more evident than during the COVID-19 pandemic. By the time the World Health Organization announced the discovery of a new virus in Wuhan, China, that virus was already on an aeroplane to Johannesburg. It was already present in Accra on the roadside as individuals waited for a trotro at the Kwame Nkrumah Circle, or seated towards the rear of a daladala en route to Ngaramtoni. If you look beyond Africa, what you find is that that facade of the so-called global north, a group of countries that have long held themselves up as beacons of democracy and human rights, of liberty, justice, and the rule of law, is fast crumbling. Judiciaries are no longer independent. Citizens and lawful residents are being disappeared by mass law enforcement and then placed without due process indefinitely in detention centers. We see executive overreach and a steady weakening of legislative independence. We see violations of international law. Restrictions are being placed on freedom of speech, assembly, and protest. There's a general loss of liberties and a sharp decline in public trust in governments. Mwalimu Julius K. Nyerere famously said, "One does not judge one's state of health by comparing yourself to a sick person." For far too long, we compared ourselves to the West and used what we believe were their standards as our benchmarks for all our endeavors. The reality we see today should serve as a clear call to action. What should be our paradigm in understanding and interacting with the rest of the world, even as we preserve our dignity and cultural identity as Africans? Honorable judges, ladies and gentlemen, I call upon African Union member states who have not yet ratified the protocol to please do so without delay. To my colleagues, heads of states in these countries, I assure you that you have nothing to fear from this court. I humbly ask all African nations and individuals to respect and implement the court's judgments in good faith, and to also make the declaration to allow individuals and non-governmental organizations direct access to this court. My father's political tribulations did not end with his detention after he wrote his unsolicited letter advising the head of state. He had to live in exile again for 13 years after another coup d'etat. But many others suffered even greater injustice and abuse of their rights and dignity. Many individuals have endured significant hardship throughout their lives. The Lumumbas, the Modlanis, the Sankaras, the Cabrals, the Prempes, the Yasantues, the Kabalegas, the Nyomas, Mandelas, and Bikos are all recognized as martyrs of the African Revolution. The African Court of Human and People's Rights existed earlier in our past. These grave instances of human rights abuses and injustice would have been a very important case for you to adjudicate. Would have secured justice against racist apartheid criminals, colonialists, and even our own oppressive African dictators who tortured and sent many of their countrymen to death, and countrymen and women to death. As I said earlier, all the nations on the African continent are each other's keeper, and I truly believe this. I also believe that each of us is a keeper of the dreams and hopes of our ancestors, hopes and dreams that they could not achieve. We've paved the way for their dreams to be realized, if not by us, then by generations succeeding us. Justice systems in Africa have strengthened over the past decade. In Ghana, we're strengthening our own judicial systems. As I stand and recollect my youth and my fear for my father through my recurring nightmares, I realize that I can put those fears to rest. For the past 20 years, we've had a court that can protect the rights and dignity of African people beyond the borders of our individual nations.
Ghanaian President John Mahama has asked a very good question. The question that I would also like to ask, is Africa the next? Is African continent the next? Because when you take a look of what is happening with the Western leaders or the Western powers, what they are doing is that they are going against all the countries that are facing sanctions and all the countries that are having the resources. That's the country that today America, Israel, and other foreign powers are fighting, going to intervene, trying to force the regime change, and doing a lot of things that is today is being seen as destructive to the world countries. Now, we know that many of the African countries today, which are at least having some resources, some richness, which are having some leaders who are trying to protect their own richness, are facing the attack by America. We have seen this happening in Venezuela. Again, we have seen this happening in Iran. We saw this happening in Libya and other countries from the global west, from the global south. So what is happening today is that all we need as Africa is to unite. When African continent can unite, we can be able to overcome this, because if we are not ready to unite, we are going to face the same that as how other countries or other nations are facing. Because at this time, we know well that there are many African countries which are under the sanctions by the American country. Why are they being under sanctions? Because they refuse to bow, they refuse to kneel, they refused to wait for the permission. They are making their own bold decisions, and this is what is making the world to feel like the world leaders or the Western world to feel like these are the African countries which are going against their own will, because they made Africa to believe in democracy. They made Africa countries to believe in independence. They made us to believe that we need to be helped each and every time. We cannot be able to stand up and make our own decisions. That's why each and every time we are having any leader who's trying to stand up and try to awaken Africans, that are coming out to find any reason to make sure that they take them down. So at this time, we know clearly that Africa is trying to do something that the world is against. When we saw the African youths are coming out to stand to fight for the sovereignty, for the unity, for the independence, there are some African leaders themselves, the African leaders are our own, who are not in support of this, because they're submitting to the Western leaders. They're submitting the former colonizers, because they're benefiting from it. They're getting something small from it. They're being helped to secure their own power, position to power. So if we Africans cannot be able today to stand up and plan ourselves, organize ourselves on how we can be united, then automatically it means that we are going to face this, because there are some leaders in Africa who are still welcoming the Western leaders, giving them the way, opening the gates for them. And by doing this, there are some African leaders who are hating each other. So this means that there are some African leaders who are friends to the people, and there are some African leaders who are enemy to the people. Because once you are an African leader and you are the friend to the citizens, then it means that you are an enemy to the Western world. You are an enemy to the foreign policy. So what happened next? They have to find a reason on how to eliminate you and take you out of that position, and install their own, whom will allow them to come and access to African richness, because they need what you're having at any cost. That's why they're ready to kill, they're ready to destroy, and to make sure that they get whatever they want. That's why today we are watching things happening across the world, which they're calling it a regime change. But this is not regime change, because We saw this happening in different countries across Africa. And what happened next is just the history. Today, if you can remember what happened in the country of Libya, you can understand what I'm talking about. If you can remember what happened in Iraq, you can understand what I'm speaking about. That's why today, each and every time, we say that we need a united Africa. Because when we as Africa unite, we are going to avoid a lot of things or a lot of damages to be done in African continent. So John Mahama has come out to issue this statement and speak about the world nations and how they are treating the world powers, how they are treating the world leaders and the countries which have resources which fail to bow before them. This is what they are facing. So today Iran is facing the same as what. So at this time, it's the matter of Africans to stand up and make sure that we protect our continent, we protect our resources, we protect our countries in order to be safe and be able to access to what we're having, what the world is fighting for. Be blessed, I appreciate you doing great by tuning the Black History. Keep on subscribing, sharing, so that continue creating space to discuss more about Africa. Be blessed and peace out.